Hi everyone, Tova here. Welcome and thank you for joining the Taub Center's live stream, where we'll be discussing the opportunities and challenges facing Israeli society during the coronavirus crisis. And thanks for bearing with us. I know we're a few minutes late. Taub Center President and Professor of Economics at Bar-Ilan University, Professor Avi Weiss, will be presenting a number of findings from a recently published State of the Nation report, which provides a comprehensive overview of the key social and economic issues in Israel. So you can download the full report for free, as with the rest of our research, on the Taub Center website. And you can also keep up with us and our work by following us here on this Facebook page. At the end of Avi's presentation, we'll have a Q&A session, so you can write your questions in the comment section of this post at any time during the presentation, and we'll address them at the end. So with that, Avi, I'll give you the floor.
Thank you very much, Tova. Sorry for the delay, everybody. I'm going to share my screen and show you the presentation. So I'm going to apologize because the first graph, for some reason, is in here in Hebrew and not in English, but I'll tell you what it shows so that you'll be able to see what's going on. So we're going to basically take a really quick sketch of a lot of different things that have been happening. These are some main findings from our latest research, and let's start with a little bit of macroeconomics. So macroeconomics, of course, gives us the overall view. And again, this is the one that's in Hebrew. So what this is GDP per capita. GDP per capita over time. In Israel, we tend to look, or at least at the Taub Center, we tend to focus on GDP per capita and not just on GDP. The reason is that Israel is growing at about 1.9% per year in its population size. And if you don't take that into account in your calculations, you're really going to skew things very, very significantly. So by looking at GDP per capita, we take a look at what happened in 2020. We can see that the GDP per capita fell very significantly from where it was expected to be. And it fell to about the range it was 4 years earlier in 2016. So basically, 4 years of growth were basically erased in 2020. Now, what's going to happen from here on depends on how quickly Israel manages to get out of the current situation. If it manages to continue vaccinating very, very quickly, because we have had, as you probably know, very, very high rate of vaccinations being given in Israel. If that continues, then you're going to see Israel getting out of the virus much quicker than if that does not continue. Specifically, if that continues, we are expected to close most of that gap in about 2 years and be able to get back to where we would have been, still be a little bit lower, but not a lot lower. If, however, we do not open completely, the economy is not able to open up as a result of quick vaccinations, then we're going to retain about a 2-year gap in GDP per capita between what would have been without coronavirus and what happened with coronavirus. So that's with respect to overall production. Two other macroeconomic numbers that are very, very important tend to be the deficit and the debt to GDP ratio. Now, the deficit in Israel had been falling over a very long period, and it fell to the 1 to 2% over a fairly long period of time. And then in 2018, 2019, some agreements were made by the finance ministry that shot that deficit back up. In 2020, the expectation had been that you would have been at about 3.9 to about 4.5%, depending on who was doing the projections. And what happened, obviously, in reality, is that was shot to pieces. And the result was, in every country, and certainly in Israel also, a lot of money was spent trying to help the populations that were harmed very, very greatly by corona. And that obviously shot the deficit way up. It wasn't just that. It's also that Israel collected fewer taxes than they would have, I guess, less taxes than they would have otherwise. And they had much higher expenditures. Until a couple of days ago, it was expected, until yesterday, in fact, it was expected that the result would have been worse than what you see over here. But here we're showing a deficit of about 11.2% in 2020, which is actually not as bad as people had expected. 2021, again, you have those two different possibilities, one where you get the virus under control, one where you don't. If you get the virus under control, you're still expecting a high deficit of about 8%. If you don't, you're going to retain an even higher deficit of about 11%. What's clear is that until you're past this situation, you're not going to be able to get those deficits down. Israel continues to spend a lot of money. For instance, unemployment benefits were guaranteed through the end of July. Very significant amount of unemployment benefits. and therefore those deficits are going to stay high for a while. It is going to be important to get those down later on. If you take a look at the debt to GDP ratio, Israel had done incredibly well, had lowered its debt to GDP ratio down to 60%, which was actually the rate that the EU had requested when it was looking at member states in the EU. Israel is one of the actually few countries that actually managed to get it all the way down there. Most countries, or at least many of the countries, stayed way above the 60% level. It's now back up this year, again, as a result of all the spending, to about 72% this year. Again, that's lower than was expected a short while ago. In 2021, we're going to continue spending. It'll get up to about 75% if you get things under control, and about 82% if you do not. Moving from the macroeconomic picture of what's going on in Israel, we take a look at the unemployment inside of Israel. Now, unemployment was redefined. Unemployment standardly basically means somebody who is not working, but is looking for a job. So those are the only people who are included in unemployed, not working, but looking for a job during the period when things were being checked. Now, because of the huge number, the way Israel handled the crisis was unlike what happened in Germany, unlike what happened in many European countries. Israel had all the workers who were laid off, had them temporarily laid off, no longer be in direct contact with their employer, but rather get their unemployment benefits, to get the payment from the unemployment service, from the Social Security service. Now, you were not able to have a partial unemployment situation. You couldn't have a situation where you were working, let's say, half-time instead of full-time, and the other half-time you would get from the Social Security service. That wasn't allowed to happen inside of Israel. Rather, it was an all-or-nothing affair. If you were put on unpaid leave, you were able to get that money. So Israel started defining unemployment with a wider view than before. Somebody previously who was put on unpaid leave would still be considered employed, and therefore that person would still be part of the employed people. They wouldn't be considered unemployed at all. But now they included those people among those unemployed. They also included a third category, but that is not shown here in this graph. The third category is people who lost their jobs as a result of the virus, but stopped looking. Basically, they gave up on looking. Perhaps some of them went back to studying in university. We did see an increase in the enrollment in universities. Perhaps some of them just said they'll never find a job, or became completely despondent with respect to the ability to find a job. So they left the labor force altogether. Those are not included in these numbers. What we're seeing here is, again, a huge increase in unemployment, way up from 3.8%, which was the lowest it had ever been in Israel, except, to my recollection, in 1966. I think it was a drop lower. But other than that, it's never been that low. And it went way up to over 16%, which hasn't been seen in Israel forever. In 2021, what we expect that if we get out quickly, quick rollout from the vaccine, then we're going to be below 8%. And then a year later, we will be below 6%. Now, those are better. That's an improvement. That's still not getting us back anywhere near the 4% we want to get to, or we would like to be at, but that's going to take a little bit more time. If we take a look in the unemployment picture about who was harmed, so what we see, first of all, is that if you divide it by gender, women were harmed more than men were. They were disproportionately harmed from the pandemic. This is showing you the result in the first shutdown. This over here was the beginning of the second shutdown. If you saw the entire numbers for the second shutdown, again, you would see that big gap. And in the third shutdown, the gap got even bigger between men and women. And if you take a look at that first shutdown over here in March and April, what happened was that women, or the numbers are that women were about 49% of the labor force, but about 57% of those who were laid off. Why is that? Well, it tended to be lower wage people who were laid off or who were put on temporary leave. And in addition, many of the types of employment, the places of employment that were shut down or partially shut down were very, very largely women, including things like education that had a lot of people who were put on unpaid leave. That continued into the second. It continued into the third. Let's take another breakdown. If we do the breakdown by academic status, then we see that those who have an academic degree suffered the least, and those who did not finish their matriculation in high school, they suffered the most. Not surprising at all, very, very expected. There are other breakdowns that we do inside of our papers, but I'm going to skip those because we are very limited in the amount of time that we have. If we take a look at what type of what industries were most affected. So these are the two shutdowns. The first one was in March, the second one was in September. And you take a look at who it was that was harmed the most. Well, it's no surprise to anybody, I think, that's here listening, that food and lodging suffered the most. They were hit, the restaurants were all shut down, and the hotels were mostly shut down. And therefore, those were very, very greatly harmed. A very large percentage were put on unpaid leave. If you take a look at what happened in education, you see a huge diversity between the first shutdown and the second one. Because in the first shutdown, a lot of the education system was shut down, but in the second, it was not. Rather, they had already gotten to the point where people were learning remotely. And therefore, they were still employed and still getting a salary. They were not put on unpaid leave, or far fewer of them were. The same is true in construction. In construction, you had, in the first shutdown, a lot of building sites that were shut down from operating. But in the second one, that really no longer happened. So therefore, you don't have that level of that number of people who were put on unpaid leave. You take a look at the top end. Well, those in information and communications and finance, they were able to work from home. So therefore, even when they were removed from physically from the place where that they were working, they were able to translate that to working from farther away. And we're going to show a little bit about that in a minute. So let's turn, in fact, to that question about the ability of to work from home. And we did a very interesting piece exactly on that question. How able are Israelis to work from home? Who is it that's able to work from home? Who is not able to work from home? This has now become a really, really critical issue worldwide because of what happened. We are expected to see a lot more people working from home than we did in the past. So take a look at what's happened with respect to the percentage of people working from home, and that should not say form; it should say from. If I remember, I'll correct it. But the percentage of people working from home in Israel has been growing, but it's still relatively low. It's lower than it is in the average in the EU countries. Now, the EU countries are very, very different from one another. If you take a country like the Netherlands, you're going to see about 14–15% working from home. If you take a country like, let's say, Romania, you're going to see less than 1% working from home. So there's a huge diversity between the countries, but Israel is on the lower side. And that surprises a lot of people because of the fact that we view ourselves as the startup nation. A lot of people view us as the startup nation. And we know that the percentage in Israel who work in high tech is higher than in any other country. Then it's surprising that not more people are working from home. But that is the situation. That doesn't mean that they won't be in the future. But for now, they are not. They, at least until 2019, they were not. So what happened in 2020? So in 2020, we see that during that first shutdown, the end of March 2020, okay, we see that 21% of the workers were working from home. When they started opening up, when they finished opening up at the beginning of July in 2020, that had gone down to about 10%. So to about half of what it was previously. But dividing that up by industry is very, very important because in high tech, half of the workers were working from home during the first shutdown. And that decreased very, very much in about half, but to over a quarter of the workers that continued to work from home, even after things were completely opened up. Now, that is a sign for the future. And in fact, there was this big survey of businesses about who would want their workers to continue working from home. And in high tech, there were quite a few companies that continue to want their workers to work from home. Google in Israel still has its offices closed. Basically, it rents a lot of floors in the Electra building in Tel Aviv. I think it was something like 17, and those are basically not being occupied. Checkpoint was going to be building a new building, and I think that they put that on hold. I'm not sure whether they'll proceed with that, but I know that they've told a lot of their workers, they've asked their workers, would you want to continue working from home? And that's something that's going to become more and more common. In financial, and that has a lot of importance, by the way. In financial and insurance services, the companies tended to not want their workers to work from home. Even though they're able to do it, they want them inside the offices. And therefore, the fall was higher from about 41% down to 18%, because they weren't particularly happy with that situation. So therefore, you'll see it less there. And of course, if you go down to the lower end, to food and beverages and to retail sale, pretty much nobody is working from home because you really can't. And in construction, it's really hard to build a building while you're sitting at home. If we take a look at there's an index of the ability to work from home. This is a whole a way of going about estimating this. But you take a look at what is the ability, given the traits of given the distribution of the different jobs inside of the country and the traits of the workers inside of Israel or inside the different countries, we see that Israel is actually towards the upper end. It has a relatively high probability, high ability to be able to work from home. Now that's promising for the future. But if we take a look and we look at where they're able to work from home, we again see that the ability to work from home is up here in information and communications, financial and insurance services. That's not only where they can, but that's not only where they can work from home, that's also where they did work from home. If we take a look at the bottom, construction and food, they didn't work from home and they really can't work from home. When you put all of that together and you take you make an estimate about what percentage of Israelis are able to work from home. Now, this is going to be based on old data, but the number you're going to come up with is going to be about 6%, which is not particularly high. But that is based on data back from 2015. This is the PIAC. These are the PIAC data. For those of you who know what that is, it's done by the. I'm sorry, I've forgotten at the moment. And it's really not giving you what it is that we need. It's done by the OECD. I'm sorry, it's done by the OECD, and it's not giving us what we need because things have changed a lot since that time. I believe if you were to do the calculation now, when we finally do get data from PIAC, I think you're going to see that it's going to be a much higher number. But one of the things that's really important in order to be able to work from home is you have to have the ability. You have to have the equipment. Now, one of the things that we see in Israel is that there are two populations that do not have good access to computing equipment or to computing services. Either they don't have internet or they don't have computers inside their homes. And this is a significant issue because it really affects your ability to work from home. It also affects the ability for the children to learn from far, which is the next thing I'm going to talk about. But if we take a look at these two populations, the Haredi population, the ultra-Orthodox population, a lot of that is by choice. They do not want computers, or many of them do not want computers inside their home, and they certainly don't want the internet inside their home, and therefore they choose not to connect to the internet, not to have a computer inside the house. For the Arab populations, it does not tend to be by choice. It tends to be a lot of it by location, because there are a lot of Arab populations in the villages in the north and in villages in the south, and they do not have good internet access from where they live. The infrastructure is just not there for quick internet, and therefore they are not able to get what they need in order to be able to improve their lot. And that's going to be very, very important for the future, because if we want to be able to get the benefit we can get from this ability to work from home, to be able to have this discussion we're having right now from so far away from each other, you're going to need that to be able to be there. Okay, taking a look at the question of education, we actually ran a very, very large survey of teachers inside of Israel together with the teachers union, and we got to 6,000 teachers, both the teachers who responded in Arabic and teachers who responded in Hebrew, and we took a look and we saw how they felt about teaching from home. Because as important as these computers and the internet is for people who want to work from far, it's in some ways even more important for children who need to learn from far. That's going to be a humongous issue. Most education people think that's going to stay with us to a large degree, not as much as it was now, of course, but that there will be future learning from home, and in which case you do need the internet, you do need the computer. But if you take a look at how the teachers felt about themselves, teachers actually were very, very positive for the most part with respect to what they underwent. It was very difficult for them, but they learned that they were able to overcome what they saw, and they felt that it empowered them. We have this whole survey that we did, a lot of questions that we're just now in the midst of analyzing, should result in some very, very interesting conclusions, and we'll see what comes out of that. Now, 2020 was to a very large extent the year of welfare. The head of our welfare program calls it. If you take a look at the expenditure that's spent by the country on welfare, this does not include all social services. This doesn't include health. It doesn't include education expenditures, just those on welfare payments, on assistance to people who need assistance. Then you see an increase over time. That goes together with the increase in the population. But you see 2020, there was a huge jump, a 42% increase in the amount of expenditure on welfare in Israel in a single year. That hasn't ever happened before, anything close to that in the past. But this indeed was a huge amount that was spent. Now, when you take a look on what it was spent on, so we have been for a while differentiating between something called social protection and social investment. The difference between the two is as follows. Social protection is giving people what they need right now. In order to be able to feed their children, put food on the table now, they need to be able to have enough money to be able to do that. And therefore, you help them directly with fiscal income. You're giving them money right now, unemployment insurance, or all kinds of grants. And that tends to be direct assistance for people. But there's also something called social investment, where you invest in their future. And you basically give them some type of training, or you put money into people hiring them and keeping them in their jobs. In other words, you're trying to improve the person's future outlook, their ability to earn a higher income later on in life. So therefore, that we call social investment. In Israel, if you take a look through 2019, you would see that there's been more lately spent on social investment than on social protection, no additional money. If you take a look at the total amount spent, you would see that social investment, social protection are almost equal to each other in terms of total expenditure. Though social protection had a while ago been most of what was spent, over time social investment pretty much caught up until it was not quite 50-50, but not that far from it. 2020 obviously was completely different. 2020, all this extra money that was spent pretty much all on social protection. You had to help those who lost their jobs. You weren't looking really to necessarily advance their skills, although that is something that was talked about and that really should have been done from the start. Though you have all these people who are in shutdowns at home, who are sitting in front of a computer, and you could have used that time in order to offer them all kinds of training, try to get to them and improve their skills, their labor market skills by giving them that type of training. And that really just was not done very much, despite it's being discussed, despite there being allocations for it. Now, what happened is that in 2021, now that has actually started up a little bit more than it was last year, but that was a slightly missed opportunity. But if you take a look at those unemployment benefits I mentioned before, you went from a situation in 2020 from about 70,000 people receiving unemployment benefits to 900,000. Those got multiplied by 13. That's a huge increase. And of course, then it went down when things opened up again. Then it went back up during the second closure. If you take a look at who was affected, so this is actually fairly important. People who were very young were very, very strongly affected. So take a look at, okay, so the underlying numbers are as follows. Employment in Israel of those under 35 is somewhere around the 37% range. If you take a look at what percentage of those under 35 are receiving unemployment benefits, it tended to be in the 30 to 32, 33% range. In other words, well below their share in the labor force. But once this happened, the young people were very disproportionately affected, and the expenditure went up to about the 45 to 47% range, much higher than it was previously. So they were disproportionately affected. Taking a look at the overall expenditure by the Israeli government on all these different programs. So this is not actually the expenditure, this is actually the allocation, because we can't compare countries with expenditure, but we do know what was allocated. So we're dividing the allocation into three parts. Into the immediate fiscal impulse. This means money that was put into the hands of people who needed it. Tax deferral basically means you don't have to pay your taxes now, you pay them later. And guarantees basically mean you can borrow money from the bank, and we, the government, will back that lending, so that if you default, we will take over that loan. In Israel, with respect to the immediate fiscal impulse, 7% was allocated. That's that's 7% of GDP. That's a very significant sum, and it's not a lot lower than some other countries, and it is a lot higher than a lot of other countries. In other words, Israel, from that perspective, put a lot of money into trying to help their citizenry and the businesses that had difficulty with cash. But they did a lot less in the other two roles. They didn't do much in the way of tax deferrals, and they did not do much in way of liquidity guarantee. So it helped. It did well in one aspect, but not in the others. But if you take a look at what was actually spent, so this part is the major part of the entire budget, and here you're talking about 66.2 billion shekel. That was well over 60%, close to 70% of what was totally allocated. And what you see is only 2/3 of that was actually spent. So you allocated a lot, but a lot of it was unused and will possibly be used, possibly just go back into the coffers. If you take a look at the issue of infrastructures, which is super important, especially for things like bringing internet to those villages in the north, then you see that only 40% of what was allocated. First of all, not that much was allocated to begin with, 4.6 billion shekel, and of that, only 40% was actually implemented. When you take a look at who feels most affected by this pandemic from a fiscal perspective, what you see is that the older, first of all, the Arab population is much more affected, feels that they suffered, that they have great fear of not being able to cover their expenses, much more than the Jewish population. And we do see that the elderly population actually feels it a lot less. And that has to do with two issues. First of all, many of them are retired, and therefore, as a result of that, their wages are not affected by this entire thing. The other part is that the people from ages 65 or more also tend to often have a lot more assets that they've saved up over the years. So therefore, they're also in less of a danger of not being able to cover their expenses. That is what I prepared for you for tonight, and I think we're going to turn this over for questions if there are any.
Okay, thank you, Avi. We do have a couple questions, and again, to the people who are watching, please feel free to post any questions you have at this point in the comment section on Facebook. So the first question is from Lucia Arias, and he asked if all of our schools are open now.
So the schools are not all open now. I mean, the schools are operating, but many of them are operating through Zoom. And they are starting to open up a little bit more. And right now they're opening up in more green towns and orange towns. They basically are grading you on how much illness you have in your city. And so there is more opening, but it's only opening for certain classes. And grades, the 5th grade through the 10th grade are basically staying closed for now. People are not going to school. They're only learning remotely. So people are learning, but most of it is remote learning. And there's more and more there are more and more schools opening up. It's happening slowly still.
Okay, great. Our second question is from
that's not great. That's terrible. We want them to open up.
Okay, our second question from Valerie Golden Berkeley. What is it about Israel's health system that made the vaccines rollout so successful compared to other countries?
It's the health system inside of Israel. It's the connection between the health funds and their patients. There are 4 health funds inside of Israel. By Israeli law, every citizen is covered in the health fund. You can move between health funds as freely as you want to. A health fund cannot turn you down, and it's public health funds. The connection is very, very tight. You have incredible information by the health funds all about your medical history. They pretty much know everything about you. It's all accessible to them online, and they're in touch with their patients, with their clients on a regular basis. And therefore, it's really easy for them to be able to get in touch with them and be able to set things up very, very quickly. You know exactly who you need to go to in order to get that done. It's just the experience is really hermetic. Everybody has it.
Okay, those are all the questions for now from the people tuning in. I will just add a question while we're thinking about Israel in relation to other countries. So you mentioned that that Israel's model for addressing unemployment was really focused on using social security payments.
Right.
And I'm wondering if you can expand on that and explain the pros and cons of that in relation to models that other countries might be using.
Okay, I think the standard comparison is always to the German model, where the German model, which was used by a lot of countries, a little bit different in different countries, was basically that the employee retained his relationship with the employer, and any benefits that he got was through the employer. So the employer would keep the employee working at a lower level. They would not be working a 100% job anymore. They'd go down to a 60% job or a 40% job, and the difference, or a percentage of the difference, would be paid by the government to the employer, and the employer would pay that money to the employee. So the employee was not getting money from the government directly. It was getting money from the same a company that it was from whom he was always getting his salary. So that retained a relationship between them, and it also allowed for part-time work rather than just all or nothing. The Israeli system did not do that. The Israeli system, well, this was discussed very, very early on, and in fact, we some of the people at our center very much pushed for employing the German model inside of Israel also. But that was not done because of certain concerns that the finance ministry in particular had with respect to what would happen inside those firms, that they felt that there would be a lot of abuse of the system. And the difference is that the German model has existed for a long time, and Germany actually has pretty good, a very good way of watching how much time people spend in their jobs. And therefore they get regular reporting on that anyway, and therefore they're able to watch over what's happening inside those firms a little bit better. And the fear was that from Israel, but we don't have anything like that, that it would be very, very hard to know what was going on inside the firms. And the fear was that a lot of firms would keep their workers on, say that they've gone down to only 40% work, but actually keep them working full time and getting the money from the government. So that was a very, very, very big fear inside of the country, and they decided not to go with that model. The plus of that model, the German model, is that when you reopen, it's much easier for the worker to get reabsorbed inside the workforce because he's already there. He's already part of the firm. It retains that connection much stronger than if you are on unpaid leave, but all that means is that you're not with your firm anymore, really. It's you're listed as them, as being there, but you're not really doing anything with them at all. So therefore, when things reopen, it's much easier not to renew that connection. And that was much harder in the German model. So there are pluses and negatives for each. The other plus of that is allowing part-time work, which wasn't allowed inside of Israel, which is something that really would have been very, very beneficial.
Okay, thank you for that. We have another question from Ruth Musher. You note a large difference between Haredim who have no internet from those with no computer, 72% versus 42% respectively. I wonder how accurate these numbers are because it's not clear how you can use a computer without internet other than a fancy word processing system, filing system, and bookkeeping.
Well, I couldn't swear to those numbers. They're not anything that I collected personally. These are collected by the Central Bureau of Statistics. But obviously you can do lots of computer work without internet, and there are many who do not want that internet connection. Because they fear what will come over that internet connection. Even if you get yourself a kosher internet, they fear what type of things that their children are going to see on there. But there's lots of work that people do with computers that they don't need the internet for. I mean, I don't necessarily need it when I have to write a new paper so you guys can see it.
Okay, another question along similar lines from Elad Sharon. Could the online tools that are being developed for education lead to more education gains down the line?
To more education gains? I mean, certainly it's going to change the school system. What's happened is definitely going to leave its mark. We've learned that, schools are going to become more of a social place that it's important for social cohesion than just for education. A lot of the education people have in the past gotten from their teachers or in school almost exclusively will now be gotten online. And more things will be done online. You can expect that to happen. but schools will retain their importance. So I'm not sure I understand exactly what the question is. Could you repeat it? Will it?
Sure, maybe, yeah. Could the online tools that are being developed for education lead to more education gains down the line?
So I think those are the gains you're going to get. I think that people are going to learn how to learn differently. It's going to take a lot of retraining of teachers who are going to have to learn how to act in a different way. But I do think that there are going to be benefits from it. But I also think there are going to be huge benefits with respect to employment. And I didn't talk about that. But when I think about, again, I'm going to go back to the Arab-Israeli population. The Arab-Israeli population, a very large percentage, as I said, lives in all kinds of villages in the north. And during high school, they tend to train themselves a lot in things like computers and sciences. And when they then go to college, a very small percentage actually go into those fields, although that percentage is increasing, but it's still a very small percentage who go into those fields. And a large part of the reason is they fear they're not going to be able to find a job afterwards. And part of that has to do with how far they are from the center of the country. So either they have to move and uproot themselves from the society that they know, that they've lived in their entire lives, and go and live in a place that is foreign to them and be able to get a good job, or they'll have to go back into the more standard types of work like education and medicine, which is fine, but it's not going to give them the high salaries that they could have gotten in high tech. Now, when you now have this ability to work from afar, then that can have a huge effect on your ability to work remotely altogether, maybe not completely, but to a large extent, and to be able to continue your studies in those type of studies and improve your situation. Now, this can also have a huge effect on things like the amount of congestion on Israeli roads, the importance of public transportation, and even on real estate prices. Because if you think about all these offices saying we don't need so much office space, a lot of that could end up being freed up. You could end up having a lot more apartments outside of Israel. You could have people deciding that they want to live more suburbanly, be able to get a larger house or a larger apartment, rather than living in Tel Aviv in a small place. They could live further away if the transportation is better, and if they can work remotely, then that can allow them to do that more freely. So that could lower the demand inside of Tel Aviv. That could lower prices inside of Tel Aviv. Now, I don't know to what extent any of this is going to happen, but a lot of that is very, very possible.
Right. So is your sense that these changes are kind of here to stay in Israel and around the world?
Oh, yeah, I really do think that they are. The question is to what extent and in what industries. In Israel in particular, given how deeply it is in high tech, and that's something that's just increasing, then you would see that potential is pretty high.
Okay, those are all the questions. So I think we are all set. Thank you very much. Thank you to everyone for tuning in.
Have a great night, everybody, or day.
Day, night, wherever you are. Bye.